In this jaw-dropping video, watch as a successful CFO takes on systemic racism in one of the country's most prestigious corporations. Uncover the shocking truth behind the facade of inclusivity and the lengths this courageous executive went to expose the hidden discrimination at the top. From being overlooked to launching a battle for justice, this story of resilience and empowerment will leave you questioning the real cost of success in the corporate world. Can one person really change the system? Find out now. In the bustling heart of New York City, a man named James Anderson sat at his desk in a towering financial corporation. From the outside, James appeared to be just another middle-aged African-American professional, blending in with the concrete jungle that was his office environment. His dark, sharp eyes, short-cropped hair, and well-tailored suits made him stand out only because of his competence, not because of any obvious eccentricities. Despite the mundane exterior, there was a fire inside James, one that had been quietly burning for years, waiting for the right moment to ignite. James had worked hard to climb the corporate ladder. From humble beginnings in the inner city, he had spent his early years studying late into the night, taking on odd jobs to fund his education. With a keen sense of logic and an unyielding drive, he eventually earned a spot at a prestigious firm. His rise through the ranks was steady and admirable. By the age of 40, he had earned the coveted title of Chief Financial Officer (CFO) at one of the country's leading financial institutions. But James wasn't just another suit in the corporate world. Beneath the polished surface of his professional success, there was a growing undercurrent of frustration. He had long realized that his African-American identity was something that made him stand out in ways that weren't always advantageous. Despite his qualifications, intelligence, and experience, he often felt the weight of subtle racial biases, hidden beneath the surface of casual conversations and well-dressed meetings. James was aware of these dynamics, but he never let them show. He took pride in his ability to maintain composure, even in the face of what he suspected were microaggressions. He knew that showing vulnerability or anger would only perpetuate the stereotypes that many of his colleagues harbored about him. And yet, there were moments when the sting of exclusion was so sharp, the feeling of being overlooked so pronounced, that James would retreat into himself, questioning whether his professional achievements were worth the price of his dignity. On a seemingly ordinary Friday afternoon, James found himself in an elegant conference room, preparing for yet another high-level meeting. The room was full of people who shared his background, Caucasian, male, and driven by similar ambitions. James had become accustomed to this environment, but today something felt different. As he reviewed the financial projections on his laptop, his thoughts kept drifting to the latest issue that had been gnawing at him. It wasn't just the subtle remarks during meetings, nor the dismissive tone he had encountered more times than he cared to count. It was the sheer weight of being one of the only black executives in a predominantly white corporate culture. Even after all these years, James still felt the sting of knowing he was viewed as different, not just for his abilities but because of his skin color. As the meeting commenced, James sat at the head of the table. The CEO, a middle-aged man with graying hair and an air of superiority, launched into a presentation about the company's latest venture. James didn't need to pay close attention. He had already reviewed the data earlier that morning, and he knew the numbers inside and out. His thoughts, however, remained fixated on the very issue that had been bothering him for weeks: his colleagues' treatment of him. In the midst of the meeting, a junior manager, a young man in his early 30s who had only recently been promoted, made an offhand comment. "James, I'm sure you understand the numbers. After all, you've been around for so long," he said with a tone that was meant to be complimentary, but came off as patronizing. James raised an eyebrow, trying to mask his irritation. His pulse quickened slightly, but he chose to ignore the comment, pretending to focus on the next slide. The rest of the room carried on, oblivious to the discomfort that had just been caused. But this comment wasn't an isolated incident. It was a reflection of the subtle microaggressions James had been encountering throughout his career. The assumption that he was simply around for a long time, rather than good enough to be here, was the kind of comment that grated on him. It was moments like these that made James feel like an outsider in a space where he had worked hard to belong. Despite the calm exterior, James had had enough. He'd been holding his tongue for far too long, silently suffering the indignities of a system that consistently undermined him. He knew he could never make a scene. His reputation, built carefully over the years, would crumble in an instant. But that didn't mean he couldn't find a way to make things right. He sat through the rest of the meeting, a sense of resolve building quietly within him. Little did his colleagues know, James was not the kind of man who would quietly fade into the background. He had endured enough, and this time something was going to change. But James would have to play the long game, an intricate strategy that would require patience, perseverance, and most importantly, careful timing. James left the meeting that day feeling a gnawing emptiness in his chest, but there was a sense of determination in his step that hadn't been there before. He had been here before, faced with countless challenges that were rooted in the bias and inequality of the corporate world. But this time something felt different. It wasn't just about the little slights he had faced, this was about something bigger. It was about creating a space where he, and others like him, could truly thrive without constantly fighting for acknowledgement. The issue at hand was not something that could be easily articulated or confronted head-on. It was not just about the occasional dismissive comment or the isolated incident of being overlooked. No, the problem ran much deeper than that. James was facing a systemic issue, a problem that had been ingrained in the corporate world for decades. In the weeks that followed, James began to see the issue more clearly. The more he reflected, the more he recognized a pattern that extended far beyond his own personal experiences. He wasn't the only one. Other people of color, particularly black professionals, had been dealing with similar challenges within the company. There was an unspoken hierarchy that existed, one where people like him were placed at the bottom, regardless of their qualifications or abilities. This pattern wasn't just in the workplace, it stretched into the social dynamics of the company as well. Invitations to exclusive meetings and after-hours events were often extended to certain employees, those who were seen as more like the top executives, those who shared similar backgrounds. James had never been part of that circle, despite his achievements. He knew that his exclusion was not accidental. His race was part of the equation. One afternoon, as James sat in his office, staring at the financial reports that filled his screen, he couldn't help but think about the broader societal implications of the situation. The way people like him were treated in the corporate world was just a microcosm of the larger issues in American society. Inequality, racism, and injustice were everywhere, often hidden behind a facade of politeness and professionalism. The more he thought about it, the more determined he became. He could no longer sit idly by, allowing the status quo to persist. James knew that making waves in the corporate world would not be easy. He had spent years building his reputation, carefully navigating through the complexities of office politics. He had learned the art of silence, of letting the small slights roll off his back, choosing his battles wisely. But the tension was building and James could feel it. The day was fast approaching when he could no longer ignore the weight of the injustice that surrounded him. In the weeks following the meeting with the young manager, the slights continued. But instead of responding in his usual manner, James began to take note of every instance of discrimination or microaggression. He was building a case, one that would expose the deeply rooted biases that were infecting the very fabric of the company. But James was no fool. He knew that an overt confrontation would only make matters worse. He needed to play this carefully. It wasn't just about proving that he had been wronged, it was about showing that these actions were part of a larger pattern that needed to be addressed. The stakes were high. He had to be strategic, patient, and, most importantly, calm. He began to reach out to others, quietly at first. He spoke with colleagues who shared his concerns, seeking out those who had been affected by the same issues. Slowly, a network began to form, one that was centered around the idea of justice and fairness. James wasn't sure where this would lead, but one thing was certain: things were about to change. And when they did, the world would see the real James Anderson, the man who had been underestimated, overlooked, and disregarded for far too long. James knew he was not the only one suffering from the subtle forms of discrimination in the company. There were others too. Some colleagues had been passed over for promotions. Others had been excluded from important meetings simply because of their race. These were not isolated incidents, they were part of a pattern. James wasn't sure how to address it, but he knew it had to be done. The question was how. As he thought about the injustices he had faced, James realized that the discrimination he was experiencing wasn't just personal, it was institutional. It wasn't just about the actions of a few individuals, it was about the culture that permeated the company. A culture that often overlooked people of color, treated them as if they were inferior, and made assumptions about their abilities based solely on the color of their skin. James had always believed that success was determined by merit. He had worked hard, put in the hours, and proven himself time and time again. But the constant reminders that his race made him different were beginning to wear on him. He had reached a breaking point. Something had to be done. James wasn't ready to make a public scene, but the fire within him had been lit. He began to make subtle changes in his behavior, choosing his words carefully, weighing his actions thoughtfully. He knew that in order to make a real difference, he needed to gather evidence, to show that the company's practices were systematically excluding people like him. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and late-night discussions. James began to see the true nature of the problem. It wasn't just about individual biases. It was about an ingrained system that placed barriers in front of people of color, making it harder for them to succeed. He began to gather support from other executives, carefully selecting those who had expressed similar concerns. Together, they would formulate a plan that would expose the systemic racism and inequality that had been allowed to fester for too long. James had always been one to keep his emotions in check, even in the most trying of circumstances. Yet, as the weeks wore on, the frustrations began to mount. Every email he sent, every meeting he attended, felt like an unspoken reminder of the systemic discrimination he was up against. His colleagues, some of whom had been in the industry longer than he had, continued to downplay his expertise. The subtle digs, the exclusion from critical conversations, and the occasional condescending remarks, each small injustice compounded the next, building an invisible wall around James. One afternoon, the breaking point arrived. James was called into an impromptu meeting with his direct supervisor, Stephen Harding. Stephen was a man in his mid-50s, with graying hair and a well-practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes. He had always been cordial with James, but there was an undeniable tension in their interactions. That day, Stephen informed James that he would be excluded from the annual strategy summit, a crucial event where top executives would gather to shape the company's future. "You know, James, we've been thinking," Stephen began, adjusting his tie as he sat across from James. "Given the current direction of the company, we believe it would be best if you focused more on overseeing the day-to-day financial operations rather than the strategic vision." James kept his face neutral, though his blood began to boil. He had been a part of the strategy summits for years, and his input had consistently driven success. But now, it was being taken away for reasons he knew had nothing to do with his skills or accomplishments. "Of course, Stephen," James replied, his voice steady but his mind racing. "I understand." But inside, the feeling of being sidelined, excluded once again, hit harder than he had expected. The message was clear. His voice did not matter in shaping the company's future, despite his track record of successful financial oversight. After the meeting, James couldn't shake the feeling that this was yet another example of how people of color in positions of power were often quietly pushed aside, despite their qualifications. He walked out of the conference room, his resolve hardening. This was no longer about just being overlooked, it was about fighting for a seat at the table. And he wasn't going to stand by while others continued to dismiss his contributions. That evening, James began to reach out to a few trusted allies within the company. He had already spoken with Carla, a senior marketing manager, and Mike, a fellow executive in the IT department, both of whom had expressed frustration about the lack of diversity in leadership roles. James outlined his plan. They would start documenting the systemic issues at hand, collecting evidence of biased practices and discriminatory treatment. Together, they would work to expose what had long been swept under the rug. The following weeks were a flurry of activity for James and his small but growing group of allies. They began to document instances of exclusion, marginalization, and microaggressions, both subtle and overt, occurring within the company. Each meeting, each conversation became part of a growing narrative of how racial inequality manifested in the workplace. James worked tirelessly, keeping a low profile as he gathered evidence. He had to be careful. Any misstep could result in retaliation, and that would mean the end of his career. But there were small victories along the way. Carla and Mike helped him connect with others in the company who had similar experiences. The more stories he heard, the more convinced James became that this was a systemic issue, one that reached far beyond his own experiences. At one point, during a routine board meeting, James had an unsettling realization. The company was preparing to announce a new leadership initiative, one that was supposed to showcase diversity and inclusion. However, as James looked over the list of potential candidates for promotion, he noticed a disturbing trend. Despite the company's claims of inclusivity, the people being considered for leadership roles were overwhelmingly white, with only a handful of people of color, none of whom held positions of real power. James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't an isolated issue, it was a deliberate attempt to maintain the status quo. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that the company was simply paying lip service to diversity, using it as a marketing tool without actually addressing the real barriers that kept people like him from rising through the ranks. The tension continued to mount, but James remained focused. His group of allies grew, and they began to strategize how they could approach this issue without making a spectacle of themselves. They knew that exposing the truth would require careful planning. Any sudden movements could jeopardize everything they had worked for. James had already identified a potential ally in the company's general counsel, Sarah Lopez. She had always been professional with James, and over the years, they had built a relationship based on mutual respect. James knew that if anyone could help them navigate the legal complexities of exposing the company's discriminatory practices, it was Sarah. However, bringing her into their plans was a delicate matter. He didn't want to risk her reputation or compromise her position. After a few weeks of deliberation, James finally decided to approach her. He invited Sarah to a quiet dinner at a nearby restaurant, hoping to gain her trust. "Sarah," James began, leaning forward, "I've been thinking about something for a while now, and I need your advice." Sarah looked at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "Of course, James. You know you can always count on me." James hesitated for a moment, then spoke in a low voice. "It's about the company. The way we treat diversity. I've been seeing things, and I'm afraid that it's more than just a few isolated incidents. It's a pattern, one that's built into the fabric of our organization." Sarah was silent for a moment, her eyes narrowing in thought. "I've suspected something like this for a while. But if you're talking about challenging the system, that's not something we can take lightly." James nodded. He knew that this was a dangerous path, but he also knew that they had no other choice. The company's claims of diversity and inclusion were nothing more than empty promises unless they took action. And James was prepared to do whatever it took. The pressure of living a double life was beginning to take its toll on James. By day he was the composed CFO, carefully watching his every move, keeping his emotions in check. By night, he was a man on a mission, tirelessly gathering information, meeting with allies, and building a case against the systemic inequalities in his company. But as the days went by, James began to notice a change in himself. The initial anger he had felt when he was excluded from the strategy summit had transformed into a quiet, simmering determination. He was no longer just a passive participant in his own life. He was becoming a catalyst for change. During one late-night meeting with his group, James finally laid out his plan. "We need to go public," he said, his voice steady but full of conviction. "We've gathered enough evidence. The company can't continue to operate under the guise of inclusivity while systematically excluding people of color from leadership." Carla, who had been hesitant to take such a bold step, nodded slowly. "You're right, James. But we have to be strategic about it. We can't just blow the lid off this without proper evidence and support. We'll need to approach the board first, gain their buy-in before we take it public." James agreed. They were walking a fine line between exposing the truth and protecting their careers. But he knew that the time for silence had passed. The truth needed to come to light. The more he thought about the situation, the more he realized that they weren't just fighting for their own dignity. They were fighting for future generations, those who would come after them, hoping to rise in a system that had always stacked the odds against them. This was bigger than just one company or one man's struggle. It was about creating lasting change. As James prepared to take the next steps, he knew that the battle ahead would not be easy. But he also understood that the status quo could not remain unchallenged. The tension had been building for months, and now it was time to take action. James and his allies were ready. The stakes were higher than ever, but they knew that the fight for justice was one worth undertaking. And when the time came, the world would see that the quiet, reserved man sitting at the head of the table was not just an observer of injustice. He was ready to make a stand. The day of reckoning had arrived. James had carefully navigated through months of subtle confrontations, gathering allies and preparing his case. He had reached out to key individuals in the company, trusted colleagues, A few executives who had previously expressed dissatisfaction with the company's treatment of diversity, and even an external lawyer who specialized in corporate discrimination. It was time to expose the toxic culture that had been festering beneath the polished surface of their professional environment. James had called for an emergency meeting with the board of directors, though no one yet knew exactly what the meeting would entail. There had been rumors that James had been collecting information and speaking to people, but none of the higher-ups took it seriously. They assumed it was just the typical corporate politics, some disgruntled employee stirring up trouble. As the meeting commenced, the tension in the room was palpable. The board members, a mixture of older, mostly white men and a few women, exchanged glances, unsure of what to expect. James entered the room with Carla, Mike, and Sarah by his side. They were ready, each of them armed with facts, figures, and documented evidence of the systemic discrimination that had plagued the company for years. James stood at the front of the room, his face calm and collected, though his heart was pounding. He knew that exposing the truth would come at a significant personal cost. But in this moment, the stakes were higher than his career. This was about integrity, justice, and ensuring a future for those who came after him. "Thank you all for joining on such short notice," James began, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of resolve. "I know this will be difficult to hear, but I cannot remain silent any longer." He motioned to the screen behind him, where a series of slides detailing the evidence of racial bias, exclusionary practices, and subtle microaggressions began to flash across the screen. He talked about the missed promotions, the exclusion from critical meetings, and the ways in which talented people of color were systematically pushed aside, all in favor of maintaining a homogeneous corporate leadership. The room was silent. Some of the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others leaned forward, clearly taken aback by the gravity of what James was saying. For the first time, they were forced to confront something they had long ignored, something that had been in plain sight, but veiled under the guise of politeness and corporate professionalism. Then James hit them with the most powerful piece of evidence. The company's diversity initiative, which had been advertised as a major step toward inclusivity, had been nothing but a smokescreen. The candidates considered for promotions, the diversity panels, the inclusive policies, they were all window dressing, designed to make it appear as though the company was doing something about diversity without actually making any meaningful changes. James paused, letting the weight of the moment sink in. The truth was undeniable. There was no way to argue against the documented patterns that James had uncovered. The room remained quiet for several moments until the CEO, Greg Harmon, a tall man in his late 50s with a commanding presence, finally spoke. "James," Greg said, his voice stern but surprisingly calm, "I'm sure you understand the consequences of what you're suggesting here. This could affect the company's reputation, our business relationships. It's not something we take lightly." James met his gaze, unflinching. "I understand the consequences, Greg. But I've spent my career here building this company's financial success, only to watch the people who are supposed to be leading it remain blind to the truth. We have a responsibility to do better. We can't keep perpetuating a system that undermines talent based on the color of someone's skin." The tension in the room was thick, but James wasn't backing down. His words were measured but firm, each one landing like a hammer on the walls of corporate indifference. The board members exchanged uneasy looks, but they could see the power in his conviction. This wasn't just some disgruntled employee airing grievances. This was a man who had dedicated his life to the company, and now he was demanding accountability. After the meeting, the storm that James had unleashed began to ripple through the company. The immediate fallout was intense. The board of directors called an emergency session to deliberate on James's revelations. Behind closed doors, conversations were heated as the members grappled with the undeniable evidence of systemic bias within their organization. James and his allies weren't just sitting idly by, waiting for the inevitable backlash. They had already prepared a plan to ensure that their voices would be heard. The next few days were a blur of press statements, internal company-wide meetings, and public statements about the company's commitment to change. The press picked up on the story, and soon James's brave confrontation became national news. People from all over the world were applauding his courage, and employees from other companies were starting to speak up as well. Internally, the company was forced to make swift decisions. Greg Harmon, the CEO, along with several key board members, was summoned to answer for their role in perpetuating the toxic culture. After days of intense scrutiny, Greg was ousted from his position. His resignation was announced in a carefully crafted press release, stating that he had failed to uphold the company's commitment to diversity and inclusion. This was not just a personal failure, it was a corporate failure, one that had impacted countless employees over the years. But the change didn't stop there. James was given the chance to help restructure the company's leadership diversity initiatives, and this time there would be real accountability. The company established a task force to ensure that future promotions, hiring practices, and training were free of racial bias. It was a long-term commitment, but it was a start. As James watched the first steps of real change take place, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. He had fought not just for his own dignity, but for those who had been silenced, overlooked, and marginalized. He had stood up against a system that had continuously pushed people like him to the edges, and now he was a part of changing that system. The fight wasn't over, of course. James knew that the road to true equality would be long, and that there would be many more battles to fight. But in this moment he felt a sense of triumph. He had done what few others in his position would have dared to do. And in the process he had not only secured justice for himself, but for countless others who had been waiting for someone to stand up for them. James's actions did not go unnoticed. The very same people who had dismissed him, those who had marginalized him based on his race, were now forced to reckon with the reality of their own biases. Some of them, including lower-level managers and employees, were held accountable for their discriminatory actions. The company's HR department conducted investigations into other instances of bias, and a number of individuals were either demoted or removed from their positions. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when one of the managers who had been particularly vocal in dismissing James during his career was publicly reprimanded. Mark Trenton, a senior vice president, was caught in a series of emails that had been exposed as part of the internal investigation. The emails contained explicit discussions of racial biases in hiring and promotions, as well as derogatory comments about employees of color. Mark's swift dismissal was a public statement that the company would no longer tolerate such behavior. For James, this was the moment of karma. The people who had tried to suppress his voice and undermine his contributions were now facing the consequences of their actions. It wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. The system that had been in place for so long was finally being dismantled, piece by piece. As the company slowly rebuilt itself, James found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He had started as a young man with nothing but a dream and a determination to succeed. But along the way he had realized that success wasn't just about personal achievement, it was about lifting others up, fighting for what was right, and using one's position to create meaningful change. The message of empowerment that James had unknowingly carried with him through the entire ordeal was clear. Change was possible. Even in the face of overwhelming adversity, individuals could make a difference. They could rise above the challenges that life threw at them and fight for justice, not just for themselves but for others. James had not only reclaimed his place at the table, he had reshaped the table itself. And in doing so, he had shown others that they too could stand up for what was right and fight for their own place in the world. As the dust settled, the final chapter in James's journey began to unfold. The people who had wronged him, those who had undermined his efforts, perpetuated discriminatory practices, and dismissed his contributions, were left to confront the consequences of their actions. For some, the realization came too late. They had failed to recognize James's worth, and now they were left grappling with the reality that their decisions had not only harmed him but the entire organization. Mark Trenton, the senior vice president who had once looked down on James, was forced to retire early. His public disgrace was a sobering reminder of how the culture of discrimination had operated within the company. As he left the building on his final day, there was no fanfare, no sense of triumph. Just the quiet realization that his actions had irrevocably changed the course of his career. James, on the other hand, stood at the forefront of a new era. His actions had sparked a wave of change, and he had finally earned the respect and recognition he deserved. The company had learned a hard lesson, but it was a lesson that would ensure the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. The company had undergone significant change in the wake of James's bold confrontation. The board of directors had been forced to confront their own complicity in a system that had, for far too long, allowed racial inequality to persist within their walls. The reshuffling of leadership, the dismantling of biased hiring practices, and the restructuring of diversity initiatives were just the beginning. Over the next several months, the company began to implement tangible changes: diversity training for all employees, new leadership development programs for underrepresented groups, and a clear commitment to transparency in their hiring and promotion processes. But for James, the true victory wasn't in the policy changes. It was in the fact that the system had been forced to recognize the inherent value of individuals like him. The company, once a place that made him feel like an outsider, was now evolving into a space where his voice, and the voices of others like him, could truly be heard and respected. James's journey had been arduous, and the personal cost of exposing the truth had been high. He had risked his career, his reputation, and his peace of mind. Yet, as he looked around at the changes he had helped initiate, he realized that the sacrifice had been worth it. Not only had he brought justice to himself, but he had helped create an environment where future generations of employees wouldn't have to fight the same battles he had fought. His efforts weren't without cost. Along the way, there had been moments of doubt, moments when he questioned whether the personal toll would outweigh the potential for change. But those moments of doubt had been fleeting, replaced by a growing sense of purpose. Every step he took toward justice was one step closer to a future where people like him, people of color, people with diverse backgrounds, would no longer have to prove their worth in a system stacked against them. The day the company announced their new diversity strategy was a turning point. James had been asked to speak at the press conference, a moment that he had never imagined would come. Standing at the podium with cameras flashing and reporters scribbling notes, he realized how far he had come. This wasn't just about him. It was about the future, about paving the way for others to thrive in a space that had once rejected them. "This isn't just about equality," James said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "It's about equity, ensuring that everyone, no matter their race, gender, or background, has an equal opportunity to succeed. What we're doing here today is not just a statement. It's a commitment to make sure that the mistakes of the past are not repeated. And I'm proud to be a part of that change." James's victory was not just a personal one. It was a story of empowerment for countless others. Employees across the company who had been silently suffering under the weight of systemic bias felt that a door had been opened for them, a door they had long thought was closed. The changes that followed in the company were not only symbolic, they were deeply rooted in the new policies that emphasized fairness, inclusion, and, most importantly, accountability. James had become a symbol of resilience. His actions had not only challenged the status quo but had shown others that it was possible to stand up against injustice, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. He was no longer just a CFO. He had become a leader in a movement that sought to dismantle the structures of inequality that had existed for so long. And yet, James remained humble. He knew that real change took time, and that there would always be challenges ahead. But he also knew that his story had given others the courage to speak up, to take action, and to believe in their own power. His legacy would be measured not by the titles he held or the wealth he amassed, but by the way he had used his platform to amplify the voices of those who had been silenced. As he moved forward in his career, James continued to mentor younger employees, offering guidance and support to those who were navigating the same obstacles he had faced. He found fulfillment not in the accolades or promotions, but in the opportunity to help others rise, just as he had risen from the challenges of his own life. James's work wasn't finished. He knew that the fight for equality and justice was ongoing. But he also knew that he had made a significant contribution to the future. A future where individuals, regardless of their background, could walk into a corporate environment and know that their talents and abilities were valued. And that, to James, was the greatest reward. As the company progressed through its transformation, James's journey continued to impact those who had previously opposed him. Many of the individuals who had been directly involved in perpetuating the discriminatory culture were left to reckon with the consequences of their actions. Some faced public backlash, others found their positions within the company untenable, and a few even left the corporate world altogether. Mark Trenton, the senior vice president whose emails had been exposed, was perhaps the most striking example of this. Once a powerful figure in the company, Mark now found himself without a seat at the table. He had been publicly reprimanded, and his career was effectively over. For him, the realization came too late. He had not only underestimated James but had also failed to see the changing tides of the corporate world. His regret was palpable, though it did little to ease the damage he had caused. For others, the realization of their own complicity came more gradually. Some came to understand that their actions, though perhaps not malicious, had contributed to the systemic discrimination that James had fought to expose. These individuals began to reassess their own biases and to question the systems they had been part of for so long. It was a painful process, but one that was necessary for real change to take place. James, however, was not focused on the regrets of those who had wronged him. His attention was firmly on the future where people of all backgrounds could rise to their full potential without fear of discrimination. He knew that the work was far from over, and that the process of healing and reform would require constant vigilance. Looking back on everything that had transpired, James couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in how far he had come. His journey had been filled with obstacles, but each challenge had only made him stronger. He had never asked for the fight, but he had embraced it fully. And in doing so, he had become a beacon of change not just for himself, but for others who had felt silenced, excluded, and unseen. Now, as he sat at his desk in the same office where he had once struggled to make his voice heard, he thought about the people who would follow in his footsteps. The younger generation, those who would one day fill the leadership roles at the company, would no longer have to face the same obstacles he had. They would enter a corporate environment where their worth was measured not by the color of their skin, but by their talents and abilities. James had succeeded in making the corporate world a fairer place, and in doing so he had secured a lasting legacy. The company he had worked for, the company that had once silenced him, was now a better, more inclusive place. A place where everyone had the opportunity to succeed. And that, James realized, was the ultimate victory.